Hello everyone and welcome to the History of Scotland podcast. This is the first episode of many and we're going to be covering the entire history of Scotland, ranging from the start times where there were tribes in Scotland when the Romans invaded, all the way to the end when United Kingdom existed, and all the way up to the modern times and really the modern age. So we're going to be obviously spamming a lot of years here and centuries and eras, and there's a lot of history in each of these sections. We're going to be breaking these down into single episodes, hopefully 2 episodes being released weekly. So just a bit of a breakdown what we're going to cover. We're going to obviously cover the Roman invasion, how the Caledonians and the Picts dealt with the Roman invasion, obviously the emergence of Hadrian's Wall, and obviously when the Picts became the pretty much ruler of the majority of Scotland, although there was obviously some further tribes to the west. And basically then when the Romans leave, obviously we have the Saxon invasion of England with the Angles as well, and we'll talk about how Scotland is formed between that, the Kingdom of Alba, and how that was formed, and the conversion to Christianity. And moving on from that, we'll obviously be going into the Viking Invasion, how Scotland dealt with the Viking Invasion, historical figures such as Ivor the Boneless popping into history, again how the Kingdom of Alba dealt with that and how they dealt with the Viking Invasion, similar to the Kingdom of Wessex. And then obviously when the Kingdom of Wessex eventually takes over the majority of England and forms the Kingdom of England, we'll be discussing the very risky topic of English-Scottish relations all the way from the 700 AD, 800 AD. Moving on from there, we'll obviously talk about the proper formation of early Middle Ages of Scotland when it became known as the Kingdom of Scotland, not the Kingdom of Alba. And moving on from that, we'll obviously be touching on historical figures such as William Wallace, and talking about his rebellion and kind of maybe where history is fabricated during his rebellion, obviously with the English King Edward Longshank's invasion and subjugation of Scotland. Obviously moving on from there, we'll be going into Robert de Bruce, his rebellion and how he eventually freed Scotland and it then became independent again, and the Bruce family from there. We'll obviously go into, and we're going to try and follow this with the Kingdom of England at the same time, since England is very involved in Scottish history and vice versa. So obviously we're going to touch on things when we get to Queen Mary of Scots, and in the Tudor ages, James VII to James I of Scotland, who will become King of England and Scotland, to the union of the crowns. And the idea is to get an understanding of how Scotland was throughout these periods. One common misconception with Scotland is it was never really independent. It was, England invaded and took over Scotland, and it was always under English rule, and it's never really been a country. There's lots of, misconceptions about Scotland in general, and I'm actually a English person telling this history, which is quite interesting. My family itself is Scottish, so I want to pick up on this history and a bit of a history nut when it comes to things like this. So that's how we're going to cover it. We're going to split it into these sections. Obviously we got the Roman invasion, then once the Roman invasion is left, then we're going to be touching on pre-Viking invasion, then the Viking invasion itself, and then so on. And we're going to split in segments like doing an episode basis of maybe 20 to 30 minutes. We'll go on from there. Bit of a disclaimer. Obviously I'm not a qualified historian. I am someone who learns history in his free time and researches a lot, likes reading, watching films, reading books, all about history. So when I'm quoting sources, when I'm quoting historians, when I'm trying to tell history itself, if I get things wrong, please do tell me. It's one of those things I'm going to just have to get used to as I go through the episodes, and hopefully you'll become a lot more fluent in speaking in a podcast form as we go forward as well. Some interesting details when I picked up on researching for this episode and for the future episodes is how Scotland has gone in a similar path to England, but I probably stayed more true to their heritage than maybe the English people have. So I'll just elaborate on what I mean by that. So Scotland and England and pretty much the whole of Great Britain were full of tribes. We all know that. The Romans invaded and began colonising most of southern England, okay, moving north as they progressed, building roads, building cities such as, we'll discuss them like Chester, okay, and as they moved further north, obviously they then ran into further tribes, and then once they get to Scotland, many people are puzzled why they didn't carry on and why they had to retreat from the wall. There was another wall in front of Hadrian's Wall, why they retreated from there past Hadrian's Wall, but Scotland was never fully conquered. It was never fully taken over. Hadrian's Wall was made for a reason. Romans did not want to progress further than Hadrian's Wall. They tried, and many times, many different emperors tried to conquer further into Scotland. And to be fair, southern Scotland was conquered quite a few times and successfully held before they were overrun and they retreated to Hadrian's Wall, and the process repeated. Now, when we speak about after the Roman invasion, we talk about the Saxon invasion, the Anglo invasion, and obviously their future conversion to Christianity, and they become, the four kingdoms: Wessex, East Anglia, Northumbria, and Wessex. All right. Scotland itself, obviously formed through the Picts to the Kingdom of Alba, and what's interesting about that is they didn't get invaded. Scotland itself, the Picts became Kingdom of Alba, became Kingdom of Scotland. They never really had that invasion. They obviously had the Viking Invasion, which we'll go into in more detail, which actually influenced a lot of Scottish culture itself. But Scotland itself always stayed true to its culture and for its tribes. So that's one misconception that people have, that maybe did the Saxons invade Scotland itself? Well, they didn't. They were, in fact, the Saxons, and when I say Saxons, I mean in the Angles as well. Wessex, Northumbria especially, they considered the tribes, Kingdom of Alba, the Picts, the Scots, whatever they called them back then. They considered them as barbarians as well, kind of like how they viewed the Vikings. So when the Vikings invaded, some reports were actually said it was potentially a Pict invasion by sea, which is quite an interesting view of how people viewed Scotland in those early times. Now, there is a common theme throughout history why Scotland was never fully conquered and never successfully held and never successfully conquered, and it's the land itself. Scotland is, if you've ever been to it, it's filled with mountains, it's filled with open fields. It's not going to be hard for any early to medieval army to hold that land when there is so much to hide in, so many areas to hide in, So, you've got the mountains that you can do guerrilla warfare from, you've got many forests of Scotland, the plains, some unsustainable areas in Scotland, and I think that is why, the Romans couldn't hold it properly. Obviously, we'll go into more detail on that in future episodes, while the English couldn't hold it properly, and why Scotland itself is a natural defence to any type of invasion from the north, because it's very hard to hold Scotland. The Romans, they were already stretching their supply lines in England when they were invading Scotland, and then you bring upon that guerrilla warfare of tribes working in the local areas who know the area, who know the forests, who know the hills, who know the best place to ambush the Roman army, and we throw that back to fast forward to England and the English army and the problems that they've faced when they were invading England many times. There's so many stories of English kings. The Scottish would try to invade the north of England, or they would do raids, so then the English king would trek up north and they'd try and conquer Scotland, but they'd normally get as far as Edinburgh, and then they would turn back, and it's just goodbye after that. If we're talking modern times as well, there's a reason why Special Forces and Marines train in Scotland. Quite a lot of training areas are in the Scottish Highlands, or in the Scottish areas, Scottish Islands around the mainland. It's because it's a very hard place to live if you don't know how to survive there. Obviously, in today's day and age, you can just go up there and camp with your mates, and you can go on walks, and you're not going to die. But when we're talking about the Roman times, the early medieval times, the late Tudor times, etc. Those times were hard to hold these areas, and that's why so many rulers, so many different countries could not conquer Scotland. Similar to Wales. Wales and Scotland have a very similar history in that, except Wales wasn't as big. You have the Welsh rebellions and uprisings, and the Welsh would again get invaded, and where would they go? They would go hide in the hills, Okay, the exact same would be with Scotland. When Scotland would get invaded, they would head north, as far north as they can. They would head into the hills, the forests, and they would leave their towns. The amount of times Edinburgh, as a city, the capital, was taken over by an English king, and then the English left, the Scottish took it back over, and then Scotland's back together. It's an interesting tactic, and you rarely see that in history. Kind of a country constantly having to evade another country but never hold it successfully, so having to retreat, and it's just this stalemate. And that is a key word, stalemate, because England never successfully held Scotland. England never conquered Scotland fully, completely, and held it. So that is why when you hear stories of the tyranny of the English, they've hold us under, they've never given us independence, we're talking about modern day now, they've always ruled over us, etc., etc. It's not the case, the reason why Scotland and England became one, as we'll find out in future episodes, is, through the Stuarts, Queen Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James. And when the union of the crowns was finally done under Queen Anne, and it became, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, again, it's one of those where we didn't invade Scotland. When I say we, I mean England. England didn't invade Scotland at all. Scotland never successfully invaded England. It was a stalemate, and the two countries just naturally came together through similar bloodlines. Because these two countries were so close, so closely together in terms of borders, culture, things like that. There was bound to be some crossover with families and bloodlines and claims on each of the thrones. And obviously, as we find out, Mary Queen of Scots had a claim on the Kingdom of England, and when Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen herself, died with no heirs, obviously that was a Tudor dynasty gone. So that's when the Stuarts came into the pact, and obviously the Stuarts at the time were kings and queens of Scotland. So you can even trace the Stuarts back to Robert de Bruce. His long fought rebellion successfully came to a head, because if you want to talk about that, Scotland kind of won it. Would you not say that? Scottish king became an English king, which their bloodline carried on. It's one of them. Obviously, we won't talk about Charles I and all that. But those are the common misconceptions, the interesting details that I find when I'm researching this. It's the public's image and historians throughout history and how they view Scotland. In the early days, Scotland is a ravageless land. It's inhabitable. You can't hold it. You can't conquer it. It's full of tribes. To them, when the Saxons and the Kingdom of England is eventually formed again, they viewed the lands of Scotland as an inhabitable land. You've got southern Scotland, kind of north of Cumbria, and north of kind of Newcastle area. Around there is, inhabitable, but, once you start getting past the Edinburgh line, you start going into the Great Highlands themselves, that's when things become a different story. So it's just interesting reading some of those things, even down to the Vikings fearing the Scots invasion, when you had the Danelaw in England, not only did the Vikings have to deal with Wessex, they had to deal with the Scottish, the Picts, the Picts raids, and how the Vikings viewed the Picts was interesting as well. But anyway, so we'll jump straight into kind of Scotland, kind of pre-Roman, how they were kind of set up. So there was many tribes around the Scottish area. So we're going to judge the Scottish area, the Scottish border above Hadrian's Wall for the moment. The reason for this is that's where the Roman province of England ends, Britannia, and kind of where the Scottish line starts. Now, obviously, you've got Antony's Wall as well, which is a wall in between the Firth of the Forth all the way to the west of Scotland. That was a wall that the Romans built. It took 12 years to build, but eventually got overrun, so they actually retreated back to Hadrian's Wall. Now, there was many tribes. You've got the Picts who eventually come. You've got there's other different tribes. The Taxili, I think I'm pronouncing that right, and the Autochtoni. Again, I'm butchering these names, so I do apologise. But one of the main tribes, one of the tribes that held quite a lot of Scotland was the Caledonians. Okay, and the Caledonians, obviously, they were the people that met the Romans quite a lot, and they headbutted the Romans quite a lot, and there was lots of famous battles, which we'll definitely get into. And the Caledonians were kind of that buffer to the Romans. they kind of held a lot of the southern of Scotland and the central Scotland itself. So it's interesting learning about those things and how the Picts weren't the first tribe. You had the Caledonians, you had the tribes earlier than that, and similar to how Gaul reacted to the Roman invasion, the confederacies that were formed. So again, I apologise for butchering the confederacy there, but tribes would come together in an alliance under one leader to fight off the Romans, and that would happen in Scotland a lot as well. And fun fact, the Picts were a confederation of tribes who lived in the north of the Forth in the Roman times until kind of like 10th century. They are often assumed as descendants of the Caledonians, although it's kind of unknown that. But the Pictish relationship with Rome appears to have been less overly hostile than the Caledonians one. Again, we'll go into the Caledonians. I know their wars affected that land, but in the beginning. But when Rome itself started leaving the Isles, the Picts began raiding past Hadrian's Wall and began raiding south. And Rome did struggle against it. They struggled quite a bit. Pictish kings ruled in the north and eastern of Scotland around the 700s. Obviously a bit earlier, you had the early kings who date back really to 300 AD, and that 300 AD goes all the way up to the formation of the Kingdom of Alba, which was in 943 AD. And it's interesting again learning about the name King of Picts, King of Scots, and then the Kingdom of Alba, and the name of that itself. And how the Picts formed really, and kind of the Kingdom of Picts became the Kingdom of Alba, and how that happened is still debated. Some just say it was just a name change, translation change, some obviously due to the rulers, and we'll go into them quite a bit in detail in future episodes. But it's kind of important to understand currently when the Romans invaded or began invading England, it was just full of tribes, and when future alliances were made to fight off the Romans, the Picts themselves were an alliance of tribes, and that's how they became the Kingdom of Pictland, the Kingdom of Picts, the Kingdom of Scots, to the Kingdom of Alba, and it's interesting seeing that formation. So Rome itself, obviously we have the two invasions. You obviously have the first invasion or attempted invasion of Julius Caesar. Didn't really conquer much, just more about trying to subjugate the southern territories in England, eventually just getting tribute. And they were taking these tribes out one by one, similar to how they dealt with them in Gaul. And tribes were struggling. There's a difference between, a professional Roman army, fully plated in iron armour, professional, with tactics going up against tribes of small warrior bands. So these tribes would fall. And they got to where we're going to discuss as the border in this era, Hadrian's Wall, and they carried on pushing, and they were successfully pushing. And then they got to where Antoni's Wall would be, and they were able to successfully hold there. Now when you get to the Highlands, that's where Rome stopped for a while. Okay, they started consolidating their land, and in that consolidation is when they started facing and coming into contact with the Caledonians. Now the Caledonians themselves, they have fought many battles with Rome. What you see with this is Caledonians themselves were forming alliances to try and fight off the rising Roman threat down south, and they were, defeated many times in 83 and 84 AD by Julius at Mons Grappius. Okay, and in 180 AD, they took part in the invasion of Britannia. They breached Hadrian's Wall. They weren't brought under control for quite a few years. Eventually, have to sign peace treaties with the governor. In 197 AD, the Caledonians again aided in a further attack on the Roman frontier. They helped remove the garrisons on Hadrian's Wall. Again, the Caledonians broke the treaty, which was made a few years earlier, as we just mentioned. And the governor who arrived to oversee the regaining control of Britannia had to buy peace with them and their allies. And history gets a bit sceptical on terms of when the Caledonians were attacking and weren't attacking. You've got reports in 210 AD and 230 AD, but that's when we get into kind of when the Picts were arising themselves. And Roman philosophy in Scotland was to try and take the land above Hadrian's Wall, but beneath Antony's Wall, okay? Because, again, southern Scotland isn't as bad as northern Scotland. Northern Scotland is filled with many mountains, okay? It's very hard to hold. It's very defensible for the other tribes to set up ambushes, guerrilla warfare, etc. So you got the line at Hadrian's Wall, and many, Roman legions would try and conquer Antonius' Wall, even before Antonius' Wall was built. And then when they tried to build it, and they tried to hold it, and they got overrun. But the same would be vice versa. The Caledonians and the other tribes in the area would try and raid down to Hadrian's Wall and start breaching Hadrian's Wall and start attacking around, Northumbria and Cumbria in those areas. The Romans would have to send a legion up there, the governor would have to buy their peace, similar to how the Vikings were dealt with. There'd be peace treaties of tributes and gold sent to them, go away, head back up north, here's some money, and what have you. And that's the back and forth. You got this back and forth in between Hadrian's Wall and Antonius' Wall, and that's in the southern of Scotland. And the Romans never successfully held that area, as we know, and there's many famous myths and historical stories. We hear about the Ninth Legion, told in, the story of the Eagle of the Ninth, okay, and how the Ninth Legion trekked beyond Hadrian's Wall to the many forts plotted around kind of north of there, and how they got overrun by Scottish tribes and they just vanished. And they were never seen again. Their bodies were never found. The standard of the Ninth Legion itself was lost, which to the Romans was a tremendous defeat. Not only losing your men and the Legion itself, but losing that standard that you took with you across all the land. Okay, when you have a legion that served in Italy, Africa, the Middle East, and then it comes up to Scotland and loses that. That's that is a defeat in itself. And the Romans really kind of towards the 200 AD era, they kind of just wanted to hold Hadrian's Wall as best they could, but the incursions of the tribes, the Caledonians and the further tribes in the Scottish area past Hadrian's Wall, even started to harm the northern sector of the province. And Rome itself, when eventually it became the Eastern Roman Empire and it began to fall, Britannia was one of the first places to fall, because it was just, you already had the tribes in Scotland constantly raiding down, and if there's no Roman legions holding Hadrian's Wall, when you speak about Hadrian's Wall, think about it, it's a literal wall from east to west of England. Fair enough, it's that short point, but it's a massive ass wall. So you think about how many troops are going to have to guard every section of that wall, every section. No wonder tribes were able to get past and raid and successfully retreat back behind the wall. And I think the Romans realised that too late, and their earlier incursions into the land really was pointless as well. They did not gain anything from that. So yeah, it's just one of them, I think. And this is where the problem and the trouble with occupying Scotland, is first kind of shown to us in history. Okay, Rome, the Roman legions themselves, they have conquered most of the known world, or the most, early world in that sense. Okay, they control all of the Mediterranean, but they cannot conquer Scotland. They could not go past those lines. They conquered England. They even influenced Wales. They conquered the lands they did in Europe, but they could not go past Scotland, and that's where you first see that trend, okay? The trend that we'll see later repeated with the Vikings, with the English kings, and eventually, when it gets to the modern day, when armies themselves want to train, they will train in Scotland, okay? So, the southern part of Scotland, with those tribes, now we're talking in between Antonius' Wall and Hadrian's Wall, so the southern part of Scotland, and even north of that, it was heavily influenced by Roman culture eventually. Okay, so we obviously talk about how the kingdom of Picts, the kingdom of Alba, eventually converts to Christianity, due in part to Roman influence and culture. Roads, clothing, trade, coin, armor, weapons, tactics, all things tribes used and kind of not stole but traded with Romans. Similar to how tribes down south worked with the Romans, there'd be tribes in the southern part of Scotland that would not fight the Roman occupation, and they would trade with them. So any tribes north of Hadrian's Wall would happily trade with the Romans, and they would be happily influenced by them. Now, obviously, you have this recurring theme of other tribes seeing that as, pathetic. You are giving in to invaders, and those tribes would never get along. But the southern part of Scotland was influenced by Rome, and was influenced by the Roman culture that it brought. And again, that is another interesting fact about not all of these tribes were basically, they weren't just barbarians as referred to by the Romans. They weren't. They were influenced by the Roman culture, and they became very unique people in themselves, having their own culture, but also Roman culture influenced upon them. And that hybrid you'll see later formed when the Kingdom of Scotland is formed, and the culture that Rome has brought to the British Isles in itself, influenced Wessex, and it influenced Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, and it also influenced Scottish tribes, and that is not really stated to us in history. When we think of Scotland, Scotland only becomes known and becomes a Christian country, becomes an untribal country when it gets to the Kingdom of Elvis stage. But before then, it's still these tribes did borrow the culture. They did use and follow the life of a Roman, or at least some of them did. You see that repeated throughout any type of Roman province that they invaded. Sometimes it's easier to follow the bigger power rather than rebel against it. Alright. So that's what we're going to be learning on our next episode. In our next episode, we're going to be learning about the tribes' wars with the Romans, the Caledonians, how Hadrian's Wall itself was built, Antonian's Wall was built, the Roman incursions in between Hadrian's Wall and Antonian's Wall, the mystery of the Ninth Legion, the wars the Caledonians fought, the incursions they did, and then eventually when we get through these episodes, we'll be talking about the Roman, the Eastern Roman Empire and how it left Britannia, how the Kingdom of Picts was formed, and the land that they owned, and the other tribes that the Kingdom of Picts didn't own. And those are kind of our next few episodes, what we're going to be touching on. So we've got a few heavy episodes in terms of warfare in the next couple. Again, there was never peaceful times between the Romans and the tribes. There were some tribes that, as I've said, were subjugated and happily would follow the Roman ways and pay tribute and be governed, but the tribes of Scotland did rise up, they did defend their land, and they successfully held it, and there's a reason why Antony's Wall itself fell, there's a reason why incursions past Hadrian's Wall happened, there's a reason why Scotland is known as a natural barrier, and there's a reason why Scotland itself did not collapse to the Roman invasion and stayed independent all the way up until the union between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a review on iTunes or on PodBean, or Spotify. I am new to this, and this is my first episode in a history podcast format, so I am open to criticism. If there's any historical inaccuracies, please do tell me and I will correct them in the next episode. All these episodes are currently available on YouTube, Spotify and iTunes, so you may listen to them on whatever device or whatever platform you prefer. Yeah, if you want to leave any ratings or any feedback, that would be mostly appreciated. Other than that, gentle listeners, have a great week. Hopefully coronavirus is not affecting you all too much, and I'm most likely be releasing the episode hopefully on Friday, Saturday of this week. Make sure we are obviously staying safe in these troubling times we are currently in, and we have a nice exciting future ahead of us with the history of Scotland throughout all of its tribulations, how its culture changes, to its kingdom changes, to its identity, and how Scotland still remains to this day, in my eyes, an independent entity of the United Kingdom, and how its culture should be revered and admired, really. Okay. Have a great week, guys, and I will see you all on the next History of Scotland podcast. Stay safe.